Okay, we are officially live. I apologize for the little delay there. I have Dr. Richard Carrier with me here today on my channel, Bullet Holes in the Bible. I'm very, very excited to have him. Dr. Carrier has been a huge influence in my own life, theology, and deconstruction, and I thought it was incredibly valuable to get some of his time today and just sort of go through some of his books that have helped me and, of course, answer really basic questions about scholarship. Richard Carrier has a PhD in the history of philosophy from Columbia University and is a published philosopher and historian specializing in contemporary philosophy of naturalism and Greco-Roman philosophy, science, and religion, including the origins of Christianity. He blogs regularly, lectures for community groups worldwide, and teaches courses online. He is the author of many books, including Sensing Goodness Without God, On the Historicity of Jesus, and The Scientists in the Early Roman Empire, as well as chapters in several anthologies and articles in academic journals. For more info about Dr. Carrier and his work, see www.richardcarrier.info. And by the way, his blog at his website is just tremendously robust and has so many amazing, well-written articles. So, Dr. Carrier, thank you for coming on today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to be here.
Definitely, definitely. So, before we kind of jump into the meat and potatoes of your work, I wanted to first address some, I guess you would say, essential knowledge and essential understanding of how scholarship works. I have a lot of Christians who tend to talk with me and through different mediums about how I'm choosing to trust my sources of information, but they're choosing to trust their source. Of course, their source is the New Testament or their local pastor, and
Right.
so it's really hard for some people to make a distinction between those two so-called sources. So before we get into peer review research and how that works, could you just tell us really quickly what are your degrees in specifically? What did you study?
Yeah, I got my degree, my undergrad degree in history at Berkeley with a minor in classical civilizations, and then got a fellowship to Columbia University and completed the master of philosophy, and then ultimately the PhD at Columbia University in history with emphasis on Greco-Roman religion, particularly Roman Empire, religion, philosophy, and historiography, which is the study of historians of the period and how they did the things they did. So yeah, that was my thing. And my dissertation at Columbia was what became the book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. So I basically looked at social views of the scientist, including aspects of Christian views versus pagan views. But the emphasis of it was mostly the pagan society
Mm-hmm.
and that thing. But that was my dissertation. That became two books, which was Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, which is a little book on ancient education and the differences between Christians and pagans as well on that. And then it's science content. And then I did The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, which is the rest of it, and then expanded it with more discussion of Christian intellectual history related to that. So that's what I got started on. But then I immediately, as soon as I got my PhD, got a postdoc research grant to do a study on the historicity of Jesus, which was a 6-year project and ended up with producing, several books now, 2 peer-reviewed books, several peer-reviewed journal articles, were all the outcome of that research project.
Perfect. Awesome. I'm sure that your studies into the similarities and differences between Christianity and paganism was extremely enlightening in your sort of process of developing your own understanding. But you mentioned peer-reviewed research, and just for the audience here, I know again many of them are kind of new to sort of the scholarly level of conversation. What is peer-reviewed research?
Yeah, typically when something is properly peer reviewed, whether it's a book or an article for an academic journal, the material will go to usually 2 experts in the field. They'll usually be professors or retired professors with a good pedigree in the field, like they have good CVs. So they'll take it out to, and you won't know who they are. So if you're a scholar and you're submitting this, it's blind review. So they usually try to make it double blind so that the scholars don't even know who you are either. That isn't always possible, but generally you don't know who your peer reviewers are. And it's usually at least 2. And then they review the book, and what their job is not to say whether they agree with the conclusion or not. Their job is to make sure that it meets the standards of the field. Is this a serious piece of scholarship? Have they done the work? Are there any obvious like gross errors that need to be corrected and so forth? And very often peer review will result in peer review reports that will say, yeah, we passed this as long as you correct these mistakes or something like that, or you do these revisions or whatever. So sometimes peer review has two effects. One is it blocks totally crank things from getting through usually, because it is a filter that makes sure that there are real experts who are making sure that this meets the standards of the field, but also it'll improve the work. So not only are you doing it, not only are you working harder to pass peer review because you know it's going to be reviewed by two experts in the field and they have to pass it, so you're going to do better work, but also the peer review reports will often come back with like correction lists and things so that the end result is better as well. So peer review doesn't guarantee that what comes through is always great or reliable or true, but it is a filter that filters out a lot of bad stuff so that you have a good reason to actually take this seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, that's basically the objective of peer review. It's a good filter too, because it's a thing that tells you like, okay, so there are multiple experts who said that you should at least read this and take it seriously and interact with it. And so that filters out a lot of stuff that you generally want to avoid, because there's a lot of really terrible argumentation that you find in amateur works online and in print, frankly. So that is the point of peer review.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, you still have to approach anything that's peer reviewed. You still have to approach it critically. But it's the starting point for building larger bodies of scholarship and more scholars coming on board with a particular theory and debating a particular theory.
Awesome. So it's essentially, I like that you mentioned it's blind and sometimes even double blind. So essentially what it is a process, if I'm re-explaining this correctly, that kind of filters out any sort of like hack job scholarship. At least it does its best to, and also probably tries to filter out any like obvious bias, or obvious sort of, you can see where people sort of build philosophies and theologies to try and just support their own personal, convictions or ideas. And this is also part of the process of trying to make sure, look, we need to make sure the information that enters into peer-reviewed journals is information that is untainted by those things as much as possible, so that the scholarly community can build off of that research and move forward from there.
Yeah, exactly. And to give you an example of the kind of thing that peer reviewers look at is if you make an assertion, they're generally looking to see, do you cite evidence for it? And does that evidence really exist? Or do you cite other scholars, other peer-reviewed scholarship? And does that scholarship discuss the thing? And the point being is that if you are a reader and you're now approaching this article or book, you can trust usually that you can actually follow the breadcrumbs, right? So like the information is there so you can actually check to see if the scholar is correctly reporting the evidence, if the evidence actually supports their argument, and are there other scholars, do they actually say the things that they say, and so on. And so that's one of the standards of the field that allows you to actually fact check this stuff, rather than someone just giving a sermon where you're not even sure, like, well, where are you getting that information? How do you even know any of that's true, right? And and so that's the kind of thing that peer review makes articles and books of a higher quality for that reason, because they're easier for readers to vet them. And that's one of the goals of the standards of the field. Right.
And you personally have 2 books that have been peer reviewed. What are those books again?
Yeah. I mean, if you don't count you could count my dissertation. So the 2 books that came out, they're based on my dissertation. Like, dissertations are the most peer reviewed books you can get. But apart from that, the 2 books that I have are Proving History, which is, the subtitle is Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And that's when you get a research project like this. When I got the research grant and I did the project for my postdoc, the first thing you do is method. So we got to nail down what are our methods, what methods should we be applying. And so I did a lot of research on what methods are being used in Jesus studies, and found, not only did I find that they were terrible, I found that every peer-reviewed dedicated study of those methods agreed that they were terrible. So that there's actually no study that has affirmed these methods as reliable. And so what I did is I just basically summarized what these scholars said, made some points of my own building out on that, and then tried to offer an alternative way to do things, like using other methods from other fields of history, and then breaking them down into the probability logic of them. And so that's basically what I did in that. And that's mostly just a generic, like, this is philosophy of history. This is how we should be thinking about history. This is how we confirm a historical conclusion is true or false, or probable or improbable, as the case may be. But there's one chapter in there, which is chapter 5, which is all on the methods and examples of these methods in Jesus studies, showing that applying these methods doesn't work. And so it's not just me pontificating. I actually, cite a bunch of other scholars who've made the same points in a variety of different sources, different scholarship, brought it all together and show that these methods don't work. Mm-hmm. And so that was Proving History, and that was peer reviewed by a mathematician, professor of mathematics, and a professor of biblical studies. And then after that, a few years later, I finally came out with On the Historicity of Jesus, which is the big peer-reviewed study of the whole field of this question. And so that was a big topic because I had to do, the methodology was done, but I had to do the rest, which is setting the context. If you're going to interpret evidence, you have to understand the context. Mm-hmm. And I had found in my research that a lot of historians who are approaching this subject are not getting the context right, or even not aware of key pieces of context. And it's not that they're all ignorant of certain things. It's just, you could pick a scholar and they don't know one thing, and then this other scholar might know that one thing, but then they don't know something else, right? So I had to build out the background evidence that I think was important for contextualizing the origins of Christianity. And that section of the book is useful no matter what you think about the historicity of Jesus, because it gives you context that any theory has to be compatible with. So even if you're going to argue that there was a historical Jesus, your theory still has to fit this evidence, this other background evidence. And there are versions of the historical Jesus that do. So, and then the second half is, there's a lot of arguments that have been made and a lot of evidence that have been proposed to establish the historical existence of Jesus. And so I just have to go through all of that, just go through all the furniture and then show like what's wrong with each piece of it. And how, if you look at it more closely, it's in some cases even flips the other way, that it looks like evidence against the historicity of Jesus. Right. And then in the end, I don't come to a confident conclusion. I have very wide margins of error. And I end up admitting that it could be as high as a 1 in 3 chance that there was a historical Jesus. And then, of course, one can talk about what are the most plausible historical Jesuses, which is another, that's actually what's occupying most of mainstream scholarship today, is that debate. Mm-hmm. And there's not really come to a consensus on it, but there's a general consensus on what the plausible options are. And they are very diverse, all the way from Jesus was an armed rebel who got whitewashed as a pacifist, to, Jesus was a fairly typical rabbi who didn't really teach anything all that radical, but his supporters really venerated him, and thus came to this belief that he must have been this super being that they go into worship. So there's a variety of different models of the historical Jesus that does fit the evidence. And so, so my top margin of error is 1 in 3 chance that one of those is true. But I find on balance, that means that probably he didn't exist, that he started as a revelatory being that people only knew in visions and dreams, similar to Angel Moroni in Mormonism. Or in Islam, of course, Muhammad claims that the angel Gabriel came to him and taught him all the things. Right. That the Quran is really just the speeches of Gabriel, essentially. So my view is that, and this is the only view that has passed peer review, that of an origin of Christianity without a Jesus, is this idea that he started like this. He started like Moroni or Gabriel, as sort of revelatory being, and then a lifetime later, people historicized him, put him on Earth in Earth history, and gave him a story to allegorize and teach his teachings, basically, to sort of teach what their gospel is. And they do this with a method. This book that I recommend people read on this is John Dominic Crossan's book, The Power of Parable. And the subtitle is something like How Fiction by Jesus Became Fiction About Jesus. And in his idea, he believes that Jesus existed and taught certain things, but that the Gospels take the things Jesus taught and then turn them into stories about Jesus. And the stories are fiction, but they work the same way as his parables, right? His parables tell a story. The story is not true, but it teaches some moral, right? Like you understand something. Like there was no Samaritan who was waylaid that people ignored, right? Like that's the idea, but the story teaches you something about the gospel, like how you should react to people, how society should work or shouldn't work, and so on. And so John Dominic Crossan's point is that that's what the Gospels are. They're just extended parables in which Jesus is the central character. And so the idea is that they're fiction, But in his model, of course, they're fiction about a real historical man and his teachings. But they aren't historical stories. They aren't memories of what he did. It's an example of what I'm talking about there. So, yeah. So anyway, that's where we get to where I think happened is they did that to Jesus. And then a lifetime or two later, a certain sect or sects decided that they needed to sell that as true, and then basically cut out of their mission anyone who would deny that. And so the original idea of Jesus as a revelatory being and his stories only being allegorical got shunted to the side and basically eclipsed. And that version of Christianity didn't succeed politically. The one that succeeded is the one that became basically the Vatican and then split off into other sects like the Ethiopian and the Eastern Orthodox and all of that. But they all stem from the same tradition, which are hardcore historicists. And one thing all mainstream scholars will agree about this is that to promote their version of Christianity, they generated a vast amount of fake literature. Like we know that of the titles of something like 40 different gospels existed. No one believes almost any of those are like legitimate gospels. Like there's fictions. There are multiple books of Acts beyond the one that we have in the canonical text. There are numerous epistles are forged. Like Third Corinthians was faked because they didn't like the original version of resurrection that Paul was teaching, so they needed Paul to have taught a different version of resurrection. So they invented a letter written by Paul in which he promotes the version that they want, right? So the Christians were basically inventing fake letters, fake gospels and things like that to sell their religion. And then of course they did it a lot. There's a lot of legends grew up that were not based on anything. So basically fabricating stuff was very common and typical. Christians weren't the only ones doing it. A lot of fake Jewish literature Jews did the same thing. Pagans did the same thing. Like religion was this kind of area where making up literature to sell your particular version of things was kind of the norm. Really. And this makes it very difficult to reconstruct a historical Jesus, even if that's what your goal is. But it also makes it hard to even prove that there was a historical Jesus for this reason, because of the way that evidence has been curated and selected. Anyway, that's what I deal with in my book. And even if you don't agree with the conclusion, I survey all the evidence, so it's all there. So basically you have the package that you can look at and evaluate yourself. And that would be the biggest value of the main book, which is on the historicity of Jesus, which it's filled with tons of information that you can use in your own pursuit of the historical Jesus, if that's what you want to do.
Just giving you a good framework and methodology whereby you can approach the data, scientifically, so to speak. Right.
As scientifically as we can. Right.
Yeah. Would you say Clementine literature falls into that same category? It's just additional.
I think First Clement is authentic. Myself. I don't think it was written in the 90s. I'm not entirely confident it was written by the future Pope Clement. I think that's a legend, but I do think it was written by an actual person in the 60s AD. So I think it's a very important document for early Christianity. But all the other stuff attributed to Clement is definitely not by the same author. Like we can show stylistically that it's written by other people. So that's all forgery.
Gotcha.
And there's multiple letters of Clement that have been forged. There's the Clementine homilies. There's there's a whole body, and it gets weirder and weirder. I don't know if anybody's looked at it. It's a very strange body of literature.
We used to read the Clementine homilies and really get into that stuff, along with a lot of apocryphal writings. We're into Enoch and Ascension of Isaiah. And Ascension of Isaiah, in our understanding of that. And so, like I told you before we started, I was sort of a Messianic Jew, but in a very secty sect of that, where typical, I guess you would call it Hebrew roots type stuff. But we were very, very in tune with the apocryphal literature. And when I started listening to some of your lectures and reading some of your literature, I really connected with Jesus from Outer Space specifically because I already had a sort of a understanding of the 7 layers of heaven and the Hebrew cosmology and the idea that the temple, for us, we believed that the Garden of Eden was the original temple, and it was pulled up into the first heavens or the high heavens somewhere. And so, the goal would be to bring that temple back down in the future when the veil, when the sky is shattered and all this stuff. So,
wow, yeah.
So when
that's not out of alignment with some of the beliefs of the ancient world, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm really trying to dig back. I mean, like I said before I finally started deconstructing, my last straw I was holding on to was just like, okay, I'm an Ebionite, but even that failed the test of my own research when I started getting into the historicity of Jesus. So I always assumed that the Bible was accurate, and I always assumed the historicity of Jesus was well supported. And I, like you said, there are plenty of scholars who will make an argument for that. But I had not heard any of the, I guess you would call it mythicists. Is that the right word to use, mythicist position?
Yeah, for default, there's not really a better word in floating
Default.
around.
Yeah.
It can be somewhat misleading because the mythicist thesis that has survived peer review twice now, because Raphael Lataster did a review book on it.
Oh, okay.
Published by Brill, which is another major peer-reviewed academic press. So there's two of us on that.
Wow.
And that book is Raphael Lataster's book, Questioning the Historicity of Jesus.
Okay.
Where he does an analysis comparing my peer-reviewed book and its arguments with attempts to rebut it, basically, and showing the weaknesses of the response. But I find, like, as I mentioned before, like, whether you think Jesus existed or not, if you want to build a plausible model of a historical Jesus, you do have to interact with the peer-reviewed mythicist literature, because we show the problems. We really front load the problems with the evidence. And so you do have to overcome those problems or admit that they exist and work around them somehow. And so that's still valuable, even if you're going to work on a historical Jesus project. But one thing that the historians, the consensus now has agreed, is that it's really, really hard to come to any agreement on what Jesus, if he existed, what he really taught, what he really did.
Which Jesus, right?
Right, which Jesus. and there's a lot, I want to emphasize the uncertainty aspect of it too. So it's not necessarily, they say, like, well, that all scholars agree that no, he didn't say hardly anything that he's attributed to him. What they say is that, like, we don't know what he said, that like we can't tell if this is something he really said or something someone else attributed to him. It's often very difficult to do. Sometimes I do think we can show that he didn't teach certain things. I think Dale Allison did a really good study of the Sermon on the Mount, and he shows through historical analysis that was clearly composed after the Jewish War, which is like 30 years after Jesus died. So the Sermon on the Mount doesn't come from Jesus.
Right.
And he would argue, like, maybe snippets of it do, like they just threw in little things that he said, maybe that passed down through oral tradition.
Right.
But the sermon itself and almost all of its content is a later fabrication.
Right.
And Dale Allison is a mainstream scholar. He's not a mythicist. He believes there's a historical Jesus, but he makes a really good case for this. And this is the kind of evidence that I gather in my book, is that there's a lot of different historians who are making these points. That they themselves are not concluding Jesus didn't exist, but they're admitting that the evidence is deeply problematic. And so that's the value of, like, approaching mythicist literature, is even if you don't have to agree with the thesis, but you do have to wrestle with the points we're making in terms of what the evidence is and what the problems are with the evidence.
Right. I really appreciate that. I know that for the longest time, and maybe still, there's some sort of taboo associated with even discussing mythologized or mythical Jesus, as opposed to, the Bart Ehrman-esque, there's definitely a Jesus. For a while, it was almost like people approached the idea like it was some kind of conspiracy. And of course, we know that, there's documentaries like Zeitgeist and stuff that did a disservice to the mythicist position by interjecting a bunch of false information and in an attempt to debunk Jesus. They just debunk themselves. But that type of thinking still permeates the culture, the Christian culture. When I approach people to start having conversations with them about sort of these ideas, they go, "Oh, I've seen the Zeitgeist stuff. That's bull crap. That's been debunked a million times." And I'm like, no, I hate that freaking show, Zeitgeist. I hate that. So what you've done, and other scholars have done, but especially you, is really, really given the critical scholarship world and lay people like me the ammunition, I guess you would say, or at least this the data we need to say, look, there is a peer-reviewed foot in the door, more than a foot in the door, really. There's a peer-reviewed critical analysis of this idea, and it's not as far-fetched as it once was considered. And so I really just I think that's so important, and I don't know how fast this type of thinking will impact people and maybe soften their hearts to maybe at least considering it, like you said, at least considering the methodology, because you can't say both sides of an argument in my opinion, until you research your opinions on this, or not opinions, but your research on this. But I want to kind of go back a little bit You mentioned sort of Euhemerization, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's just the process of historicizing someone who's not literally alive. Is that correct?
Yeah, the term comes from Euhemerus, who was this author who was kind of mocking religion when he originally did this. Is that he made up a story, invented a history, wrote this book in which Zeus essentially and Uranus were actual ancient kings who were deified, right? Which is not true. They were always cosmic gods. There's no human history to them. But inventing this idea and kind of pushing the idea that all gods were used to be actual people and were just venerated, right? That process became popular both by people who wanted to mock religion, but also by religious people in general, because they wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to take this idea of let's put our gods in history. And we have the example for Osiris. So like Osiris was always a celestial being. And then eventually he got turned into a pharaoh. It's like he was an ancient pharaoh who lived in a particular time. And in the case for Egypt, we have really good records because there's a lot of inscriptions going all the way back thousands of years. We have good records of who was a pharaoh when. And so we know there was no pharaoh Osiris, right? Like we know that was a made up story later. But they liked the idea of doing it. So they took the celestial deity, turned him into a historical character who was deified after his death, essentially.
Right.
And so then we have many other examples of this. Romulus started as Quirinus, who was this celestial deity, but he got turned into an actual hero who founded the city of Rome in an actual historical time. They borrowed myths of other Greek heroes, completely unrelated, and then overlapped them on him to create a Romulus myth. So we have examples like that. We know like Bacchus, Dionysus, this particular god, was a celestial deity all the way back in the Mycenaean times, but then he got turned into a historical hero and given gospel stories about him and stuff.
Right.
So this trend, which began originally to mock religion, actually got picked up by religious people to actually promote their religion. And so the process is it's named after the guy who first did it, Euhemerus. So to euhemerize something is to take a celestial deity and turn them into a historical person.
Right.
And so yes, that is what happened to Jesus, and notably, it happened to all other savior lords. So, like a lot of people don't know the context is that personal saviors were all the rage when Christianity started. Like there were already a bunch of these guys who were these sons of God who lived in some particular historical period, supposedly underwent some sort of suffering or struggle, sometimes a death, and then were vindicated, resurrected or whatever, and then became a god that you could then petition for your own salvation in the afterlife. So you could gain personal salvation in the afterlife through these savior deities. And these religions involved baptism, so you'd be baptized into their death and resurrection. They had Lord's suppers, so they had meals that you would commune with the god through these meals, through your fellows. So they had fictive kinship. You all called each other brothers and sisters. So it has all of these features that we see in Christianity. So Christianity is really just a Jewish version of this.
Right.
So it's very Jewish. Like they all the differences between Christianity and these other savior cults, all of them usually can be attributed to the Jewish element. So like they basically take something, they change stuff up to make it compatible with Jewish thinking. But when you have that merger, that syncretism of the savior cults and Judaism, you get Christianity.
Right.
And you could have predicted it in the 1st century BC. If someone were an expert on religion back then and you went to them and said, what would happen if the Jews made one of these religions? What would be its features? And they could list off every aspect.
He looked like the prophet, like Moses, probably.
Yeah, right. They could just list off everything. Like it would be a sacrificial atoning death, right? So because you have to replace the Yom Kippur and the Passover,
right?
Like they would basically just list it all out. And the baptism would have would be an adoption by God. Like they could predict all of the things that the Jews would import into their version. And so anyway, because all of these savior cults were euhemerizing their gods, it's completely expected that the Christians would do so as well, which gives us added reason to make sure that if we're going to claim that Jesus is the exception, he's the lone one who actually did exist, we need better evidence for that, because the trend line looks the other way. Like he's fitting into a body of different religions where the heroes didn't exist, but were claimed to exist. And they all had gospels, the equivalent of gospels written about them. So we have to say, well, if Jesus is the exception, we need better evidence. So that's where the quest starts, essentially.
And that's been one of my core questions from the beginning. I did a video on my channel called "Jesus is Dionysus," and I put an archetype. And in that, that's really the essentially the end of that video is like, look, if this was a historical figure that we can support historically, why was it necessary for the authors to incorporate all these motifs from Dionysus and like you said, Romulus and other pre-existing, or other examples?
Yeah.
And in the Hellenization period, and I kind of want to touch on this shortly, which was really probably, would you say, like 400 BCE through the second century, somewhere in there?
Officially, the Hellenistic period starts with Alexander the Great. So, so you think like late 300s,
okay,
or early 300s. Sorry, early 300s ish is about the time when Alexander the Great started to get involved.
Right.
And so Aristotle is considered like the dividing point between classical Greece and Hellenistic Greece.
Oh, okay.
And Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great.
Yeah. Okay. So one of my thoughts here, and I'd love to get your input on this, is when Paul, by the time we get to Paul's writings, in 50s, 60s, somewhere in there, CE, we're already the stage is already set. Like you, in a way, you mentioned this. The stage is already set for the so-called Gentile Greek people, or the Hellenized Jewish people, who also were very familiar with Greco-Roman ideals. The stage is already set for them to accept a savior character like this, because they were already familiar with these motifs and these sort of ideas. And so when you have this, sort of this narrative that Paul would go to the Gentiles, so to speak, and you see the Gentile church being supposedly built through Paul in the first century, if we can even say that that's completely accurate. What most Christians don't really understand is that this wasn't something that was sort of a wildfire of conversion because it's such a profound novel truth, and such a groundbreaking spiritual enlightenment, but more, it may have been popular because it was already popular, and Paul's version of this was very palatable to the people in that area. And additionally, there were not only competing ideologies, but there was also competing church builders, so to speak, competing people like Paul, who would have intentionally been looking for ways to sort of, make his cult the most popular one, and sort of incorporating the ideas that he feels would be most palatable to the people in that region. Do you think that's sort of true, or?
No, absolutely. And in fact, it was popular in two ways. One, the way you just described, where they're marketing this religion that is already familiar to their target audience, right? Like, oh, we already know about these kinds of religions. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is a good one. I like this. Mm-hmm. But also the Jewish component. There were already a large number of Gentiles who liked Judaism, and there's actually an active conversion. So back in this time, there were actually Jewish evangelists who were looking for converts, and there were Gentiles who were excited by Judaism. They found aspects of it appealing.
Right.
There were an even larger number of Gentiles who found it appealing, but didn't quite like the restrictions. Like, you gotta, circumcision, that's not great. The dietary laws are a little restrictive. Like, the laws were too restrictive, but they still really like the religion. And so they were called God-fearers. And so they would basically associate with synagogues and things like that. And so there was already a ready-made market. And when Paul comes out and says, oh, you don't have to get circumcised, you don't have to follow the dietary laws, he's got this market. There are people who already want this version of Judaism. They're already eager for it. And then he's coming along selling it to them. And so that became the most popular version. And that is the version that exploded and completely overwhelmed the original church. The original church was a Jewish church. You had to be a Jew to be a Christian. You had to convert to Judaism and follow the Torah, basically, to be a Christian. That version of Christianity never exploded. It was never very successful, and died out within a few hundred years, essentially. Unless it became Islam, which is a whole other. There's a lot of suggestion that halal is kind of like an evolution of kosher, right? So it looks like Islam could be sort of a revitalization of one of these original Torah observant sects.
Wow.
In the same way that Mormonism is kind of like an offshoot of Gentile Christianity. Whether that's the case or not is a whole other argument. But there's a lot of interesting parallels there.
I see that for sure.
Right. But so other than that, if that happened or not, the sect does appear to have died out. There don't appear to be any more of them after the 5th century. And they're also already really minority, even in the 4th and 5th century. So no, the religion that we're familiar with is this new innovation that Paul came along and created. And it had a ready-made market that these people who knew both these models, the savior cult model, and they're already into Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a well packaged thing. And so, yeah, it was already popular.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an easy sell, at least to a certain number of people, right? And
Right.
and then it evolves over time, but that's the original explosion of it in the first century.
Right. So speaking about Paul specifically, I think one key piece of information that I wish every single Christian on earth was aware of, because it really, for some reason, it really triggered something in my mind, was the realization that Paul's writings about Jesus were the actual first writings that we know of about Jesus. And
right.
more importantly, Paul's version of Jesus was a sort of an Ephesians 6:12 version of Jesus, where we were, it's a sort of a transcendent spiritual experience. He wasn't a physical walking around dude cooking fish and stuff like that. Most of that, of course, as you already know, was sort of added during the Euhemerization process through the Gospel of Mark specifically. So, can you tell us real quickly the order in which you believe the writings of the New Testament were sort of published? Not all of them, of course, but most importantly, the letters of Paul and then the Gospels.
Yeah, and just to briefly build on what you just said,
sure.
Even if you take away the question of the historicity of Jesus, that's all still true, and it's the mainstream agreement among scholars that it's true for the resurrected Jesus. Mm-hmm. The fact that there was a guy walking around having dinner parties after his death, right. That is universally agreed to be made up, right? Like that is a fictional person, right? Mm-hmm. That is an invented historical Jesus. The actual historical
even
Jesus.
Bart Ehrman believes that.
Oh yeah. Even Ehrman would agree. Even Ehrman would agree that there wasn't this fish-eating Jesus showing
right.
up after his death. That he just died. He died and stayed dead. Mm-hmm. And then it began with visions. So they agree that this is a revelatory being. In the Bart Ehrman model, the revelatory part happens after his historical death, right? So there's a historical Jesus, he dies, and then people have dreams and visions of him from outer space communicating. So he's gone to outer space in this new resurrection body, mm-hmm. and he's saying, "Hey, I've been vindicated by God. The resurrection has begun. I'm the first to be raised, and the rest of the world will be raised soon. Like the end is nigh, right? Like that's the model that Bart Ehrman agrees is what happened. And, mm-hmm. and many scholars actually concur with that as the model. So it's important to note that if you can invent a historical resurrected Jesus, the dinner party Jesus, dinner party zombie or whatever, if you can invent that, the same process that would result in inventing that from a revelatory risen Jesus could do it to a historical Jesus, right? So if you could do it to a post-mortem Jesus, you could do it to a pre-mortem Jesus. Mm-hmm. So mythicism is actually not really a stretch, right? Mm-hmm. It's just saying that you just keep pushing the clock back. Otherwise, it's the same model, right? It started revelatory and became historicized later. And this is a point that I make in my book, Jesus from Outer Space, which is the actual title of it, which is the colloquial version, basically the quick summary of the reason I think the conclusion is correct on the historicity of Jesus. The Unhistoricity of Jesus is this huge, thick academic book with all the footnotes and all of that stuff in immense detail. Jesus from Outer Space is the quick introduction that mm-hmm. if you really want to see, like, what are we talking about? Why do we think it's plausible? And that's the one to look at. And then there are arguments in there that aren't on the historicity of Jesus because they're arguments that historians take for granted, but most people aren't aware of, right? Mm-hmm. So, like how do we prove the existence of Hannibal or Spartacus, mm-hmm. right? And then comparing those with Jesus and why they're different. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of thing that happens in that book. So I just wanted to give that quick point for people that can still use this model and this way of talking about things, regardless of where you land on the historical existence of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But in answer to your question, there's about 7 letters of Paul are agreed to be authentic and were written in the 50s AD. That's the mainstream consensus. There's a few fringe challenges to that, but if you wanted to stick with what is the broadest consensus and what I think is most likely is those 7 authentic letters are written in the 50s by Paul. The other letters, you mentioned Ephesians, are Deutero-Pauline, so they're someone pretending to be Paul writing later. Ephesians and Colossians are probably late 1st century, and they definitely come from the Pauline sect. So whoever's writing them is not Paul, but there's someone who's from his mm-hmm. the sect that he started, right? Mm-hmm. So they definitely have affinities for Paul, but the pastorals, which would be Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy, those are agreed to be generally 2nd century forgeries, and they have more of a political purpose. Paul was very egalitarian. He was there will be neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. Like his idea is we're all one people and we have a commune and we're all equals. So he's pushing equality. That was not popular when the church became institutionalized. They really wanted to reassert gender hierarchies and other social status hierarchies. So they invented, for instance, First Timothy, which talks about women not being allowed to speak in church and not being able to have an authority over a man. That's a fabrication. That is, Paul did not take that position. That is a position that later church wanted Paul to have taken. And so they just invented a letter, basically, to making him say that. And so that's, people need to be aware of that, right? Of that kind of thing. So if you look at the 7 authentics, and you can Google it, people can find the list. It's talked about all over what the scholars think are the 7 authentic letters of Paul. And those also are pastiches, by the way. They're not, so like 1 Corinthians is not a single letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. It's actually multiple letters that have been stitched together and we're missing pieces. And we don't know for sure if these were multiple letters sent to Corinth, or if they're multiple letters and they're just claiming to be one letter sent to Corinth, even though they were sent to different congregations. We don't know. And all the other letters like Romans and stuff, we can see that they're actually stitched together multiple letters.
And there's consensus
so
on
they've
this?
been edited.
A lot of, primarily?
Yeah, right. So I would say scholars who do serious study on intertextuality in the epistles of Paul are aware of this and do comment on it. And there's some cases where it's obvious. Romans has multiple endings and multiple introductions, so it's obvious letters are being stitched together. But there are scholars who argue that there's more stitching going on than even that. And those scholars, I would say, would be a minority of scholars, but I think largely because no one's paying attention to them rather than it being unpopular. The basic idea that there's stitching going on, that is pretty much agreed by people who actually look at the letters and write on it. But how much stitching, that's debated. So anyway, that's that. And then you have that's in the 50s. I think Hebrews and First Clement were written in the 60s. So right after that, probably right after Paul died, I would say. And then we get the Jewish War, which is a crucial, catastrophic moment that kind of changed everything. Mainly not just because it happened and resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple and everything, but the world didn't end. This was the biggest problem. It's like God came, allowed the Romans to destroy his house and his temple cult and the city and all of this, and it's just gone. And we're still here. He hasn't come to end the world yet. Like, what's going on? And so I think in reaction to this, and I think a lot of scholars agree that this is the case, that Gospels were written in reaction to this catastrophe that they have to explain. Like, okay, why hasn't the world ended yet? Why did God allow this to happen? What's going on? And then to market their religion. So they create these stories that allow missionaries to basically sell the gospel by telling stories borrowed from the book. This basic idea. And to give you an example, like there's a story in Mark where Jesus is made to renounce his family. And he says, no, these people here who are following me, they are my brothers and sisters and mothers. And that is actually a story you can tell to market fictive kinship model of Christianity, because they're going around saying if your family is not satisfying you, you should leave your family and join our family and become the brothers of basically brothers of the Lord, become sisters and brothers of the Lord. And so if you want to promote that, you want to tell a story about how even Jesus himself said, he renounced his family and said that his followers. And so the story is fictive. It's made up in order to market the idea that they're selling. And so the whole Gospels are built like that. But each pericope in there is a little story that you can tell as a missionary to sell a certain point, and not just for people you're trying to convert, but also against opposing Christians who are selling a different idea, right? So like if your intersectarian dispute can be fought by telling these stories.
Gotcha.
And that's why it starts to become important for Jesus to be actually historical. The stories start to have to be true, because if your argument is, well, no, Jesus said and did this, but they say, but no, you just made that up. Like that doesn't sell, right? Like so it starts to become important to insist that these are true stories, and that's how it becomes historicized more and more over time. And you see that through the trajectory from Mark to John, right? And it goes. Mark, by the way, is the first gospel. A lot of people don't know that because they think Matthew was, but no. The consensus of scholarship. There are a few minor scholars who think the other way around, but most scholars by far agree that Mark is the first gospel, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. And you can see the trajectory. Mark is just writing a fable. He doesn't he just tells it right out as this is a fabulous story. We're just going to tell it as it is. Doesn't discuss sources, doesn't say any of it's true or anything like that. He even has Jesus say, like, to outsiders we're telling stories, but to insiders the real meaning is being conveyed. So like he gives you a tip to how to read the whole gospel.
Right.
Matthew makes it look like a Torah book, right? He makes it look like one of the books of the Bible, like Exodus or something like that. Deuteronomy, actually, he's one of his main models. And so he makes it look like a Jewish history book. Luke comes along and he makes it look like a Hellenistic history book. He puts in the little features that are common to histories. But by the time you get to John is outright saying, if you don't believe this stuff literally happened, you're damned, basically. Right. So John is actually pushing the idea that what he's selling is true. Don't take it as allegory. No, this stuff really happened, dude. And so you see it get historicized over time, from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. It's getting more historicized. You see the pressure.
Isn't it true, too, that we don't actually know who wrote the four Gospels, and the names were attributed to them after?
Yes, that's the mainstream conclusion. The main reason being is that the texts themselves don't mention the authors. So they're only in title lines. And the title lines are unusual. In fact, they're unique in ancient literature. They all say what's kata markan or kata luka. So like they basically use the Greek that says according to, and they name an author, and just a one-word author. They don't identify this author or anything. They don't say who they are or how they know anything they know or any of that. It's just a name. But all four Gospels just show up when they get into this one particular anti-Marcionite edition, when they're put together as four Gospels. They were written separately by different sects who were actually arguing with each other, but someone put them together to sort of market a unified church against another competing unified church, which is the Marcionite church. That was the Marcionite Gospel. That their New Testament was the first New Testament. And it's lost. We don't have it. Our New Testament is the response New Testament. So the opponents of Marcion cobbled together their own New Testament to battle his. And we don't have his. So we have actually the second New Testament. We don't have the original New Testament. So they put these together to market their religion and try to unify the churches that they agree with against their opponents, is the basic idea of how these Gospels get composed. But at that time when that was done, they were all assigned the same kata and the name feature. And so we know that line was added when they were put together as four. So those lines didn't exist originally. They weren't on there.
So the Gospel according to Mark wasn't even there.
Right. It was just the Gospel. Right. There was no author to it. It was all. And that was common for fiction and religious literature. If you look, for instance, the books of the Bible, there's the Jewish belief that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but that's not in the Pentateuch. There's no statement of who wrote it. There's no statement of who wrote the Kings books, the Chronicles. No statement of who wrote. They're all anonymous. Everything in there is anonymous, except for the prophets. Those are actually, like they say, according to the prophet, whatever. But the history books, they're anonymous. And so the Gospels originally were emulating that model. They don't put pride of place of their name. It's just, this is the story. This is what we believe. And it's just a community document. Later, it became important to assign names and start making myths about who these named people were and so on. But that happened a century after the books were written, or 50 to 100 years after the books were written.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too that if we're going to say, or if we're going to assume, I guess, based on research, that Mark was the first gospel where not only was it the first gospel written that we have, at least, but also it's the first attempt to sort of make Jesus human, in a sense, like on earth guy, born of a virgin, walking around. And
right, it is the first narrative history of Jesus in any form, because we don't find that in Paul. We don't find Paul talking about. He never talks about Jesus having a ministry, teaching in parables, performing miracles, anything that we attribute to Jesus. He never mentions Jesus being in Galilee. He never says that. Even when he talks about Jesus being killed or possibly having family, he never puts any of that in any particular location. He doesn't name his family. It doesn't explain how he knows any of this. It all is abstract theological conceptology. There's no narrative. And so Mark is the first time we get a narrative about Jesus. And this is after the war. It'd be about 20 to 30 years after Paul is writing.
Gotcha. I think it's interesting too. You're very familiar with Dr. McDonald's work. I did a video on my channel called Mimesis and Mark, where I lay out, I think 30 or 40 line by line, comparisons to the Homer's texts.
Yeah.
And I think for me personally, if that's that's the foundation of the four Gospels is Mark, why would this isn't really a question for you. This is just kind of me thinking out loud. But why would the authors need to build a framework off of the writings of Homer if this is all legitimately true and in such a sequential and distinct manner? Actually, you did a video with Derek at Myth Vision Podcast, which is an excellent YouTube channel, by the way, and Dr. McDonald helping to break down even further and help sort of, I guess you could say, off the cuff peer review some of his findings. And it's just really, really incredible how abundantly clear it becomes to anyone with half a brain that this was done intentionally. This was not something that was accidental. So we can see that even the framework of the Gospel of Mark was borrowed from somewhere else in a way.
Right. And it's not just Homer, it's the Septuagint too, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So there are stories, and a book I would recommend people read is Randall Helms's book, Gospel Fictions.
Okay.
And he shows many examples, not just in Mark, like Luke is doing this, everybody's doing this, where they're building stories about Jesus from stories about Elijah, stories about Elisha, stories about Moses. So they're using their own Homer, which is the Septuagint, to build stories out of. And sometimes they're doing both. They're taking materials from both and merging them together to create a new story. Right. And so it's definitely the evidence for fictionalization is pretty extensive. And you mentioned the Dionysian connection. I don't know if you've read his book.
No.
The Dionysian Gospels.
Oh,
I would recommend you could do a whole show on this actually.
Oh, great.
So to a little backstory on that is the mainstream view now of Johannine experts on the Gospel of John is that our John is multiply redacted. It's gone through multiple editors over a few decades. So we do not have the original Gospel of John. The usual view is there's three layers. There was an original version. Someone came along and added, changed, and subtracted stuff. Then someone else came along and added, changed, and subtracted stuff. And so our John is this third author. And so sometimes you can see the layers and figure it out. Sometimes you can't. But when you try to look at what the mainstream or most common view is what the first layer material is, what Dennis MacDonald finds is that it tracks the Euripides play about Dionysus, right? So the Bacchae. So he shows like the entire story of the Bacchae is in here piece by piece, and they've just retold stories using Jesus as the main character and using the gospel as the message instead of the original Bacchic teachings. Sometimes what's called transvaluing, which is where they take the story, completely flip the values being promoted, and that's the point of the story, right? Is they're changing it on purpose to say our story is better than their story, our morals are better than their morals.
Right.
That's the whole idea. And that's how Homer is used too. That's Dennis MacDonald shows that with Mark using Homer. He's transvaluing. He's taking these stories and flipping them to update the values. And Randall Helms shows this with Elijah. So like the Elijah stories, Christians are critical of the morals, the moral behavior, the moral messaging of Elijah. And so they retell the story with Jesus, and Jesus does some things a little bit differently to indicate what their values are. Like our values are different, are better than the original story. And so they want to replace the old story because the values don't resonate anymore. And they want to promote so that's what they're doing. And so once you see that this is what they're doing, and that's what John Crossan's book, The Power of Parable, is about as well, is like, this is what they're doing. Then, the whole idea that they're trying to record memories of a historical Jesus is just out the window. Like, that's not even what they're trying to do. Like, they're not even interested in that. So when you put that together with Dale Ellison on the Sermon on the Mount, you just see it over and over again that like what they're doing is just not doing history. They're not doing recording of oral lore. They're not even interested in doing those things. Wow. They want to sell the gospel by telling stories about it. And so they're making these things up, and they're making them up mostly like for the parabolic purpose. It's like, we want you to understand the message of the story. Like whether you take it literally or not, we're less interested in until you get to John. Then it's the final redaction of John. The final redactor wants to turn it into, you have to believe this stuff.
When do you think John was?
The church is, the date? So Luke acts, John uses Luke. There's a lot of evidence for that. Now there's debates as to the layering of John. So the first version of John, that's harder to date than the later versions of John. The version that we have dates definitely to no earlier than the 130s and 140s.
Wow.
Maybe the 120s at the earliest, because Luke Acts has been dated now roughly 110s to 130s. Like 115 is the sort of center date that Richard Purveau now puts at it.
Wow.
Various other scholars have come around to the same position that Acts is definitely, Luke and Acts is definitely, certainly is after 93, because it uses the Antiquities of Josephus as a source text for historical color. So we know it's after 93, but there's other evidence to suggest that it might even be after Papias. And that's a whole long digression you could get into, but because Papias doesn't mention Luke, and so there's some suggestion that it has to date after Papias, and then that's a vexed question: how do you date Papias? That's hard to do, etc. But anyway, yeah, the 115, give it like plus minus 10 years, is like the usual dating now of Luke Acts, and John has to come after that. So now we're looking at 130s, 140s, and for at least for the final redaction, the version that we have. The earlier redactions, that's much more difficult to date.
So I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then we'll start wrapping it up. But and it's kind of a statement question combo. So to me, I once heard in another lecture that Jerusalem would have been considered one of the most literate cities of its time because of their emphasis on Hebrew, and also because of the Hellenization process. There was a lot of emphasis on knowing Hebrew and Greek, and especially for the religious purpose, obviously. I can't remember. I think one of them said they guesstimated that probably 20% of Jerusalem knew how to read and write Hebrew. And is it true that there are actual writings from Jerusalem or the Judea area from between 0 and 33 CE, and yet, though we have so many writings or some writings from that area, there's nothing about Jesus? Is that correct?
That is correct. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the major point of departure here, where we know those books were written before 66, when the war started, 66 AD, and some of those books go back to about 100 BC. So they're overlapping exactly the start of Christianity. They don't mention Christianity at all. They were written by a sect that's very similar to Christianity.
Right.
They have a lot of similar teachings, and so you could see maybe some sort of ancestral relationship, some sort of connection between them. But the authors of those scrolls themselves are not a Christian sect. There's some sort of they would have been a sect. There was a cousin sect or an ancestor sect to Christianity. But yeah, they don't mention anything about this. And we don't have anything actually from the early first century. Well, we don't have anything from the first century, to be honest. Other than that's what's in the New Testament, and I would add the letter of First Clement would go into that category too, and that includes Josephus would be the first outside author who writes, and not in Hebrew. We only have him in Greek, who writes anything that might possibly mention Jesus, but both mentions are highly debatable among scholars. So right. And I think neither of them are authentic. I don't think he mentioned Jesus at all. But already we're talking 93. AD, so that's 60 years, right? So, and average human lifespan back then is 48. So if you were an adult when Jesus is around, you're going to be dead by the time the Jewish War even starts, much less alive another 20 years later. So, when you do the math on this, this is a long time that we're looking at. It's like a lifetime and a half, maybe 2 lifetimes later, before Jesus starts showing up in history, and even that's probably a forgery. And so like definite references, you have to wait another 20 years, basically. So, or more. And so, that is a problem. I mean, that in and of itself doesn't prove Jesus didn't exist, but it is a problem to contend with when you're dealing with trying to rebuild the origins of Christianity, what it really was, what the original teachings really were, and all of that.
Right. And like I said, coming from the Hebrew roots background I had, we had a lot of people who were fully believed that the Qumran sects were Christians, and they were talking about Christian ideas and things like that. So it's just really interesting to see that there's actually more of a separation there than
it's arguably proto-Christian, right? In the sense that the authors of the scrolls are talking about a future Messiah, future messianic events that they're expecting to happen. So they're like they've set the stage. They're ready to get a vision saying, oh, it's happened. The triggers have been pulled. The apocalypse is on, right? Like it's so like it does look like the sect before Christianity, right? Like right before it.
Yeah.
We can't prove definitively that that's the connection. It could be common. They could both go back to a common sect behind them rather than being direct linear relationship.
Right.
Various different causal models that would fit, but that is one model that would fit, because there's a lot of things they're talking about that end up in Christianity. But the one thing that they don't have is that the Messiah has died and atoned for sins, and this has begun the general resurrection, and the end is nigh. Like that is the thing that distinguishes Christianity from the Qumran sect. But once you take that thing out, they're almost identical, right? Like they're very similar sects. So
what was missing for us?
What it looks like is, what's that?
What was missing for us was the context of the entire, political landscape and the philosophical landscape that was already building up to this environment where it's easier for sects like the Qumran sects or Paul to come along and kind of preach the same. And so we didn't know that. So we're like, oh, this must, all be the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. Huge diversity in Jewish sectarianism before the Jewish War. In fact, it exploded in the early first century. Like there's massive amounts of diversity and innovation going on in Judaism.
Wow.
In that exact period. We know the titles or names of up to 30 different Jewish sects.
Wow.
At least 10, because some of them might be known under multiple names. But of all the names we have, there's like 30 named sects that you could find in the sources from this period. After the Jewish War, it trims out to like very few. Like basically you end up with rabbinical Pharisee, the Pharisaic rabbinical sects. You end up with 2, the Hillelites and the Shammaites, and that's all that's left basically. But before the Jewish War, it was the wild, wild west when it came to Judaism. And that is a context that people do miss a lot. Yeah, that don't know about that.
So if you could, for us in closing, tell the audience, this is primarily a Christian audience with some deconstructing their faith, or beginning to deconstruct, or at least are questioning. What of your own books, what 2 books do you think would be best suited for this audience?
Yeah, so I've mentioned Jesus from Outer Space. I would say that would be the first place to start.
That's my favorite.
And of course, that book is all aimed at explaining why I doubt the historicity of Jesus. I do think the book, and it has a concordance in the back to the academic book, which was on the historicity of Jesus. I do recommend On the Historicity of Jesus as well, because if you really want to dive into the scholarship, that book is basically a library of information. You don't have to agree with its thesis to benefit from the book. Like the book is useful to you in lots of ways.
There's sources.
It's like an encyclopedia essentially of evidence and discussions of the evidence and scholarship and so on. So I would recommend those 2. Although, it depends on what your audience is interested in. On my website, if people go to richardcarrier.info, it's richardcarrier.info, and search there for guide to my books. And then I have a whole article on all my books and what they're about, and it's designed to help people, like, what are your interests, and therefore what book should you start with, basically.
Very
so
cool.
You can read a synopsis and like, what use would each of these books be to you? And so there's counter apologetics, there's side issues like the historicity of science, or the history of science, and things like that. But anyway, that's what I would recommend people go to. For my stuff.
Can you just real quickly, last thing here, can you tell us a little bit about your book? I think it's called Sense and Goodness Without Christ. That was called. Without God.
Sense and Goodness Without God: A Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism. Now that was a title back, like, the fashion has changed in philosophy. We now call metaphysics ontology more commonly now. So it would be ontological naturalism would be the usual way that would be phrased nowadays. Metaphysical has been co-opted by wooists. You often, a metaphysical store is like selling you psychic stuff and crystals and things. But in philosophy, that's not what it means. In philosophy, it just means a basis of reality, like what it literally means after science. So what you do once you've collected all the facts of science, how do you fill all the gaps? That's metaphysics, right? Like what do you infer from the scientific findings about the rest of the world? That's metaphysics, and that comes from Aristotle. And what I did in that book is basically build out a complete worldview without a God, basically. And the mission of it was, rather than have another book about why God doesn't exist, which is about what not to believe, it's actually about what we should believe. It's mostly about positive beliefs. Like, so what do we replace this with? So what do we replace it with? Epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, even aesthetics, like theory of beauty. Like, how do we approach the world? What do we believe about the world? Given that there is no God and it's nature is all there is. Like, and so basically it just builds off of science and evidence to say, like, this is the worldview we should have. And it aims towards coherence. So all these branches will cohere together. And I teach a course online. I teach several. You can go to my website and find a link that shows the 10 courses I teach every month. But one of them is how to build your own worldview. And this is the course text. So you would get this course text and go through the readings and challenge questions and use the discussion boards and stuff in that course to build your own worldview. So basically you'd use mine as a template, right? Maybe you agree with all of it, and then bam, you've got a prepackaged worldview ready to go. But maybe you don't, but at least shows you a template of how to do this, and thus what you would need to change, what pieces to plug in and out to build your own worldview. So it's useful, even if you're not in agreement with the whole worldview, it shows you how to build a worldview. And then I have a course specifically on that. And I think that's important for people. If you're going to leave Christianity, you do need a worldview, and it needs to be coherent and evidence-based in order to conceptualize and navigate the world reliably. And so that's basically what the purpose of that book is. And,
awesome.
And it's the only book like that I know of yet. I was hoping other people would do their own versions of it, but it hasn't happened. It's really the only book on the market that does that kind of thing.
I definitely want to get that and read through it. That's probably one of the most important things, I think, for people who are, off ramping from religion in general is, they're kind of met with some questions that to us, after we've, I don't know if you've ever deconstructed or not, but to us, they might seem like silly questions, like what's moral and what's ethics without Jesus, or who am I, what's my purpose, and those type of questions.
Yeah. I don't think those are silly questions at all. I think those are like central, core, important questions that people should struggle to ask and answer themselves rather than buy a package, right? Rather than just buy a prepackaged set of answers. No, you really should think through them yourself, because then where you've landed is where you should land, because you've walked through it.
Yes.
And so that's why I think philosophy is my religion, right? It's replaced religion as its function. And I think that's really important. It's a constant task of thinking and analyzing and self-criticizing and trying to build the most accurate perspective on those things.
Absolutely agree, 100%. Well, Dr. Carrier, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and hopefully I can book you again in the future. We'll continue.
Yeah, I'd love to be on. Yeah, this has been great.
So what's the best way that we can support you in your work?
Become a Patreon supporter. So on my website, you'll find a link for Patreon, and you can go to Patreon, and then basically as you pay a certain amount a month, you can even set a maximum. It's per blog, but I only do 4 blogs a month. And then, you can set a monthly maximum once you're in Patreon and a member. And the benefits of being a Patreon are listed there on my Patreon page. You can post comments on my blog without going to moderation, for example. You can actually be a Facebook friend, and thus you can comment on my Facebook posts because those are friends only comments. So there's a variety of perks that you can get from being a patron. And that's actually my main income stream. I really benefit from that a lot. It allows me to keep blogging and doing what I'm doing, essentially. So Patreon is the best way to support me, but there's a variety of other ways, buying my books and things like that, promoting, telling people about them. And once you buy my book, read it, you love it, tell people about it. And so for other ways to support me, there is a how to help button on my website right at the top. One of the top menus, just how to help, and it lists a variety of different ways you can do it. Patreon is the easiest and most direct way to support my work.
All right. I'll make sure I link your Patreon in the description box as well. By the way, I have Dr. Carrier's website down there also, so make sure you go check out his work. I cannot emphasize enough just how extremely grateful I am for your work, for your logical, rational, and grounded perspectives without getting over emotional and without ad hominems and straw man attacks and all this. Very, very just facts. So thanks again for coming on, man. I can't thank you enough. Thank you to everyone in the chat for your donations and for watching. And until next time, I'm Justin with Bullet Holes in the Bible, and we will see you later. Thanks for watching.